Hello and welcome to this special reaction podcast with a panel of experts I'm hosting to explore the topics discussed in the recent interview I did with Andrew Rhodes, CEO of the UK Gambling Commission. There's been quite a lot of feedback and interest in the answers that Andrew put forward, perhaps sometimes the things he didn't say as well. So my panel of experts today, I'll bring in shortly, will be unpacking all of that and just explaining what the answers revealed and what maybe we need to think about looking forward for people who bet. If you're somebody that is impacted by affordability checks, you can't get your bets on, or maybe you're someone who works in the racing industry, whatever your connection is, we'll try and give some answers to you. So before I introduce my guest, first of all, say go and listen to the podcast with Andrew Rhodes first. A lot of what we say today might not make sense until you do, and then come back and listen to this. And so let me introduce my guests. First of all, I'm going to introduce my two new guests who've not been on the podcast before, so people can familiarize themselves with your voice so they know who you are. Let's start off with Dan Waugh. Dan, you work at Regulus Partners, but how would you best introduce yourself and your skill set in the betting industry?
Yeah, my name's Dan Waugh. I'm a partner at Regulus Partners. I've been in and around the betting industry for about 20 years. And the mainstay of my work is in research, particularly around effects of gambling, including benefits of gambling and also harms from gambling.
Great. So, Dan, I should say, and also my other guests here, you did help prior to the podcast in terms of preparing questions and understanding certain topics, including some of your areas of expertise there. And my next guest, again, is somebody that if you're on social media, you can't have failed to notice his posts on these topics. Chris Fawcett. Chris, great to have you on. Again, how would you best introduce yourself and what your skill set is?
So I've been a pretty heavy gambler on and off for the last 30 years. And my main sort of job, I suppose, is I design machine learning algorithms. And I'm currently working on a website called Sharp Betting, which provides tools to help gamblers. And obviously, I'm spending a lot of time looking into all these affordability checks at the moment.
Yeah, and you, like I say, prolific tweeter. And I think, is it gamblingreform.co.uk where you've got lots of links to, for example, impact studies of affordability checks?
Yeah, that's the website where I publish some of the sort of research I've done into it.
Great. Well, if people don't follow you, Chris, on Twitter, they certainly should do after listening to this. And my final guest, last but not least, is returning guest in Harry Stewart-Moore, who a betting lawyer, legal expert and partner at the firm, Gardner Leader. Harry, you were on a few episodes ago and there was a lot of interest in your podcast, not least from Andrew Rhodes himself, who in my interview with him did name check you and how he wrote a letter about some of the points you made. What can you tell us about that letter?
Well, no, he did. He wrote to me very politely and suggested that we meet up to discuss some of the issues I raised in the podcast. And I think that we will be doing that in the coming weeks.
Well, that's very encouraging, because what we do want and what we hope from the podcast interview was that new culture of engaging with not just organisations like ourselves, but whether it be the Racing Post, Justice for Punters, any of the voluntary organisations, and just bettors, because we are obviously in the majority. But I want to ask you, first of all, the three of you, your main takeaway from listening to the podcast. What was your first thought or main thoughts that sprung out of you from what Andrew Rhodes had to say?
I thought that listening to it, I ended up feeling better informed, but none the wiser. So I think, Andrew spoke very well. He's eloquent. I'm not sure we really learned an awful lot that we didn't know before. There are a few bits and pieces now, which I'm sure we'll come on to, around expectations of growth in black market betting. Also, I thought one thing was interesting was the statement that if the pilot doesn't work, the system of affordability checks will be dropped, which I don't think is something that's been said before, but obviously raises a big question, because if this new system is dropped, then does it mean we stay with the current unpalatable system?
That was a key point that jumps out at me. How about you, Chris? What was your take?
My initial reaction is he's probably the only long-term winner in the country that's never been restricted on a betting account. But yeah, my overall sort of thoughts were, like Dan, I wasn't really any the wiser. I mean, we're literally about 5 years now into this whole affordability check story. 1 year since the white paper, and he's literally, on that podcast, he was sort of asking you to walk through a fantasy land of if these new frictionless checks are going to work. And there doesn't seem to be any plan B for if they don't work.
No.
So, yeah, that was my sort of main takeaway from it.
Okay.
Well, I think fair play to him for doing it, of course. And I think some of his answers were laudably straightforward. I think, rather going back to Chris's point about the successful punting, I think the disappointment for me was the relative dismissiveness of the problem surrounding withdrawals, and that while he said he expected operators to be more transparent about that, on every occasion where he really got into the nitty-gritty, he found himself really saying, it seems to me, that he sort of sided with bookmakers on what he'd seen so far. And I think that if you are someone who has managed to be a successful punter for 20 years and able to make withdrawals, as he says he is, that's it's certainly a rare breed. And I'm not sure it's an enormously helpful one for punters, that the experience that everyone else has is not shared by the commissioner. And I think it might be that experience which leads him to slightly dismiss the dangers or the realities of withdrawals.
Yeah, because he certainly didn't seem to be accepting of the notion, and something that we talked about in our pod together, of gaming the system, bookmakers taking advantage, because, perhaps the commission views it as, well, it's people getting caught up in the net of anti-money laundering and dealing with people multi-accounting and what have you. And very much of the mindset of, well, it's only impacting a very small number of people, so why should we get involved? Which you could counter with, well, isn't that what affordability checks are there to designed to help a very small number of people? And that's okay in that frame, but not when it comes to the issue of how bookmakers are treating withdrawals.
Yes, and just very quickly following on from that, exactly that point about punters being caught up in the net of checks, it suggests that they are unavoidable victims of legitimate checks. And I think that is the wrong starting point. I think the complaints that so many of us are making is that they are targeted victims of illegitimate checks. And again, I just think the starting point is one that's not enormously helpful for those of us on perhaps this side of the debate.
Yeah. And I think it would be helpful as well to see, obviously getting Andrew on is good, but he talked about enforcement action that have taken place on some of these transgressions. And I have not seen evidence of that. So again, there's something that we can correlate. You talk about he's a winning punter, Chris. That's not something we're ever really going to approve or disprove. But when it comes to action they're actually taking, that's something we can actually see relevant detail. And so I want to ask you then about affordability. Perhaps, Chris, you want to come in because you've commented on this extensively. And since subsequent to the podcast, a few days later, it's been leaked that the affordability limits are going to be different from what has been proposed. It very much, like you say, comes into the position where there's so much fluidity here, and even 4 years in, we haven't seen any progress. What answers and how did his answers correspond with what you're seeing and what you might predict could unfold here?
Well, I think the whole problem here is that it's an outcomes-based regulation. So the operators themselves are getting fined for someone sort of losing too much money. And these breaches, some of the times you read, it's only a few £1,000s people have lost, and companies have been fined for not sort of stopping that. So given that, I find it very hard to work out quite how certainly the frictionless checks are going to provide enough information. If the premise is that the operators have to stop people losing a certain amount of money, how are they going to ever know? So many people are going to get caught up in it that can afford it, that don't have a problem, just to sort of sift out one or two people that might have a problem. It's very difficult. And just listening to the whole frictionless pilot, he seemed very keen where he said that the credit reference agencies had a very high degree of confidence they can deliver this. But we don't know. We don't know really what data it is that they're collecting. And it's not just about having the data. What's the company going to actually be able to do with that to decide, to have enough information to make a decision as to whether someone's going to suffer from harm from it?
Dan, I'll bring you in here because I did try and talk about the statistics, and you are somebody that has got a great handle on them. How about some of the points that he talks about when it comes to affordability and statistics in general, and your own take on what the Gambling Commission is doing? How did that correlate to what you understand?
Well, I think there's a slight paradox here. The Gambling Commission keeps on saying it wants to be trusted, wants to be the authoritative voice. But to sort of borrow a phrase Chris used earlier, it sort of takes these repeated saunterings through fantasy land. And one of the things I found strange in the interview was this sort of suggestion, which is not the first time we've heard it, but the suggestion from Andrew Rhodes that the Commission has no responsibility at all for the existing system of checks. And I think at one point, Andrew Rhodes said that it's simply bookmakers reacting to enforcement cases. This ignores a rather obvious point in that in 2020, the Gambling Commission, in its compliance and enforcement report, said that operators should ask for bank statements, tax returns, and P45s, any customer spending above the national average. So for the Gambling Commission to say that it's got no responsibility for this current system of ad hoc checks, it really sort of defies belief. I also know from talking with various licensing lawyers that, this guidance has come up in compliance checks, and the suggestion that, special measures are often behind the institution of these affordability checks that the people are currently objecting to. And I think the inability of the Commission to acknowledge its own complicity in what's happened here is really worrying. He also says at one point, the government does not want citizens to have to send in bank statements, but that's precisely what the Gambling Commission said it wanted back in 2020. And I think really, we're about to embark on this pilot scheme. There's an obvious precursor to that is to run a little investigation and say, why are these checks in place in the first place? What has led to them? And then secondly, what have we seen as a result? The system of ad hoc checks that's currently in place is already a pilot scheme. There's no reason why you couldn't take data from the operators involved or a sample of the big operators and take a look at when these checks have come in, what thresholds have been used, and what's happened to consumer behaviour, how many people have just walked away, the extent to which sort of gambling problems have become clear or anything like that. But there's this sort of willing amnesia on behalf of the Commission about why this whole problem exists in the first place. And I think it's really worrying that the Commission cannot sort of be transparent about that.
Yeah, because researching for my podcast, I was watching Nick Luck's interview with Andrew Rhodes, and that was a similar question. A reaction after that went out, where he's, well, we're not telling companies to do this, and operators will say, well, you are. And if we don't, we could find ourselves in serious trouble.
Yeah, it's in black and white in the report. It says you will be in breach if you're not asking customers who are spending above the national average for tax returns and bank statements and payslips. They're denying what is on their own website. And I think that's just really unhelpful. I think the Commission could quite easily, and given that this came out before Andrew Rhodes' appointment, he could quite easily come out and say, yeah, we made a mistake, the guidance was bad, etc. But to leave it there and pretend it doesn't exist or pretend it says something quite different, it's not likely to result in the trust that the Gambling Commission seems to want. And
this lack of impact, the actual impact of these checks at the moment, is sort of glaring omission, it seems, from so much discussion about this and the evidence put forward. And Chris, you've done a fair amount of work on this, haven't you? I was curious, how does the proposed increased affordability limits that have been put forward impact that at all?
So I'm not sure exactly. Given it's an outcomes-based thing, how I don't see how the companies could change what they're doing. Because if we're saying, right, you could lose, I think it's a net deposit of £5,000 a month or £25,000 a year. I mean, that seems to me far too high for the majority of people to be able to lose. So if the idea is that we're saying, we need these checks because people can't control their own spending, we need to keep an eye on it and stop people, then those limits that have been leaked just, to me, seem just far too high. But at the same time, for a sport like racing, they're not necessarily going to help that much, because 70% of racing's revenue, or the money lost on racing bets, comes from 1% of customers. And these people are betting probably way more than £5,000 a month, potentially. So I'm not sure it's going to be particularly helpful. And I think that the bookmakers themselves, the operators, will still have to carry on doing the checks they're doing anyway.
And presumably that would be 5,000 per account, the way it's currently structured.
Yeah, if you've got, say, 60 casino sites, it's just crazy the amount of money someone could lose. I mean, even with the £1,000 a day and £2,000 in 90 days, it's not really going to stop a gambling addict being able to lose an awful lot of money and avoid any kind of check.
Yeah, exactly. And then you mentioned there horse racing. One of my takeaways initially was, I don't work in racing, or I don't rely on that for a significant part of my income or my day-to-day work, because, the way it seemed quite dismissive of the concerns that many in the racing world have. And do you guys, what are your thoughts on in terms of, from a racing perspective, in terms of what he said and what's happening right now?
Well, he seemed to not really understand why 100,000 people had signed a petition to get affordability checks scrapped. His whole sort of idea is, look, it's terrible right now, this the situation where everybody's having to send in bank statements. Therefore, us and the government are now going to be the saviours bringing in this frictionless check. So why are you all complaining? This is going to be much better. But he forgets to say the point that Dan made is that the Gambling Commission are the people that brought this whole thing in the first place. So they're trying to save it. They're saying they're going to save us from something they created.
Mm-hmm.
You know, his job is broader than, a great deal broader than protecting horse racing. That's the job of the British Horse Racing Authority. I did notice, I think I agree, an element of dismissiveness on horse racing. And I thought that on 2 occasions when you asked who benefits most from people are betting more than they can afford to, the obvious answer to that, which he did admittedly give, was bookmakers. But on both occasions, he said, and horse racing. So in other words, he was sort of tying the resistance against affordability checks to the commercial interests of horse racing. I thought it was an odd response, and he did do it twice. But that was my only real takeaway. He didn't talk about horse racing a great deal, I don't think. And, you know, what we have to, I think, accept nowadays is that gambling is so much bigger than horse racing. And that's a real problem for horse racing because it wasn't always the case.
He also gave a sort of list of reasons as to why horse racing would be in decline, which none of them really stack up. When you look at the data, 2021 to 23, with the online bookmakers, betting turnover on racing is down 20%, but it's around 22% for all betting. So the common denominator is these affordability checks have come in and turnover has dropped across the board, not just racing.
Yeah. Because obviously horse racing at Pacific Impact, it's unique in its approach. And he was, like you say, fairly dismissive, it seems, of its impact there. And I want to ask you then about some of the proposed solutions, which include open banking. And that's come up in more recent times. I obviously asked him about that. It would appear it's part of it, bearing in mind the close connections between some of those running open banking and what's taking place at the Gambling Commission. What thoughts do you have on open banking? Will that actually, obviously a lot of people won't engage with it. And he seemed to have an approach that said, well, it's not particularly intrusive. But Chris, I spoke to you prior to the podcast about that, and you made it very clear that actually it can be very, very intrusive.
Yeah. So from what he said on the podcast, it was kind of unclear that he actually understood what actually is involved. I mean, I think he said something like, I don't think under open banking they see everything. Well, it would depend on what the bookmaker asked to see. So obviously the customer has to authorize the bookmaker to see, or the operator to see. They could either see some summary data, which might involve sort of income, expenditure, and a sort of total disposable income. They might also see all your gambling deposits and withdrawals. But they can also request that you send them every transaction for the last 5 years. And you click that button, they say, oh, we need this for regulatory reasons. Otherwise, we're going to, keep all your money or what have you. Then you really have no option but to say, yes, you can have all that data. So the real question to me is, what are they actually going to do with all this data? If they're asking for open banking data for affordability checks, they've already got a huge amount of data. They've got all the patterns of play data of how people are interacting with their website. What exactly are they hoping to do by knowing everyone's disposable income, by knowing, you still got people who have savings accounts, they'll have other, businesses, things that may not necessarily come up. And it seems very unclear to me as to how every single level of extra data operators get, how can they make a decision? I think the ex-Ladbrokes boss, Ken Alexander, was asked about this. And they said, if someone has £1 million, how much should they be allowed to bet? And he said 20,000. So it's that decision as to what, once you've got all this data on an individual, there seems to be no clarity about what the operator's actually supposed to do with that. And I think that's what's missing in this whole debate, is we're saying, oh, we must check all these things, we must get all these data points. But there seems to be nothing beyond that on what it's supposed to be used for.
I think that's right, actually, Chris. And I would say the way that the DCMS and the Gambling Commission are rationalising what they're currently doing is we're clearing up a mess, we're clearing up inconsistent standards in the market. Well, that will surely come to the application of what operators do. So even if you set standardised thresholds for conducting these checks, operators will do different things in light of the same information. So it then creates another situation where the Gambling Commission will come in and say, well, we've got inconsistency in the market, therefore we need to set certain rules about how much people are allowed to spend depending upon income and other things. And I think Chris makes a very, very valid point, is if the purpose here is to understand how much is affordable, which is where this all started off. I know the Gambling Commission doesn't like the term, but that's where it started off and they coined it. Then you actually need to have as much information about a customer's incomings and outgoings as possible. So you do need rather granular information. So I think we're on a very slippery slope with all of this. I don't think anyone disagrees with the principle that where possible, we should be using data and technology to prevent punters coming to grief. But it's a very slippery slope, because at what point do you say, no, there's a line here where the privacy of the punter is important and we're not going to transgress further. I just think this will lead to another step where we will be in a few years' time setting caps-based means-tested gambling, basically. You will be allowed to gamble a certain proportion of your money. Another thing I know this sounds a bit daft, but it's on the website of the Gambling Commission at the moment. The Gambling Commission considers that if you go to the cinema less as a result of your betting, then you've been harmed. So it's not beyond the realms of fantasy. You could actually get people looking and saying, oh, has this person been, reducing their spend on the cinema or other things because they've been betting, and therefore are they harmed? It's not necessarily what they're planning to do now that's of concern, albeit it is, but it's where all this goes in the future. And that could be very worrying. And there doesn't seem to be any controls around what operators or others will do with the data once it's mandated.
Yeah, and that is particularly worrying, is how is the ICO going to control this? So at the moment, there's all this data being hoovered up by the betting operators. And, I don't know where it's all sitting. Is it in Malta? Is it in Gibraltar? Is it in the Philippines? Who's actually looking at it? Who's got access? So I've had interactions myself where I said, who is actually allowed to see this data? And they say, for data protection reasons, we can't tell you. So they want to know everything about the customer. They want our unredacted bank statements, but they're not willing to, or open banking access, but they're not even willing to say who's looking at it. One company even refused to say on chat who their CEO was. So there's a big disconnect between what gamblers have been asked for and what operators are actually giving back. And I know they say, oh, you can't use this information for commercial purposes, but what tends to happen is an operator will say, because we are regulated by the Gambling Commission, we need you to provide us with unredacted bank statements, or we need you to sign up to open banking. And then I think we'll come on to later on how that data can be used against customers. Clearly every data point you have is of value, and the bookmaker is trying to beat the customer. So every time the customer gives the bookmaker a data point, it gives them a reason to increase their margin. So if someone has a huge amount of money in their bank account, and also you can see they're losing money with other bookmakers, well, that's someone you're really going to try and market to. If you see that they've perhaps withdrawn a lot of money off a betting exchange and subscribed to the Racing Post or Odds Monkey or something like that, perhaps you might think, well, we don't want that customer. There doesn't seem to be any control of the data, and there doesn't seem to be a plan as to how this, you can't use it for commercial purposes, is actually going to be enforced. That would be a concern for me.
Harry, I'd love to get your take from a legal perspective. Are you going to get a lot of clients complaining about how their data is being used?
Well, one thing that is never helpful in the law is uncertainty, because that is where you end up with disputes. And I think that has been touched on by both Dan and Chris, who I agree with completely on both of what they said, that fundamentally we don't know what affordability means. And I take the point that we've moved on from the word affordability to financial risk, but it amounts to the same thing so far as I can tell. And it is right that, nowadays, if you go and get a mortgage, they do, in fact, ask you how many times you've been to the cinema or how many times you regularly go out for lunch and that kind of thing. They're generally lending you hundreds of thousands of pounds, and they have a legitimate commercial interest in making sure you can repay it. This is a very different kettle of fish. And it increasingly seems to me that until you define what you think affordability is, what it means, I don't see how you can go looking for it, essentially. And so we seem to be devising a route to a destination, and we haven't quite decided what that destination is yet. And so Mr. Rhodes, Andrew said that he was very, he found it frustrating that he wasn't communicating to enough people, or he didn't feel the Commission had successfully communicated that this wasn't going to impact hugely on what they were doing, and that the issue that people seem to have with it was an almost philosophical one. But that's right. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, what does affordability mean in the context of gambling? People take very different approaches to gambling. And is the fact that someone decides to bet rather than go on holiday or go to the cinema, why isn't that a perfectly legitimate, normal life choice decision to make in any other regard, absent a gambling problem? And I perfectly accept the point, and I suppose there's almost certainly a link between people who spend far too much money on gambling and gambling problems. Of course, that's the case. But objective ideas of what affordability means in the context of gambling don't seem to me to be very helpful. And in a way, I think the Gambling Commission's position would be much easier to defend if what they were saying was, we've decided that anyone who gambles more than 15% of their post-tax income is betting more than they can afford. Because then at least everyone understands where they are. And it's that lack of certainty that I think everyone finds very frustrating.
Absolutely. And also the length of time, the number of consultations and pilot schemes that there seems to be no end to and no clarity. I have heard that feedback from the podcast, is that they have listened, but they come across as frustrated that people don't understand. But then there's so much lack of clarity still that it's no surprise that people don't know where they stand. Like I say, just having some rules like that could certainly help. And I wanted to circle back to something Chris just said a moment ago about bookmakers using that particular data and how they might use it. And I'm curious, and it's been put to me, is bookmakers already have so much data. They're so skilled at, some firms particularly, at working out your value or lack of value to them within the course of a few bets. So, do they not already have much more data than they're perhaps using or putting forward that they use that can really help profile and examine where there may be people who have an issue? And it probably also goes into the incentives here, is, like you say, they do make profit from losers, and putting them in charge of it is putting the fox in charge of the hen house.
Well, that's the thing, is that, if bookmakers could be trusted to do this, then why aren't they already doing it? Why did we have VIP managers? Why did people who were losing hundreds of thousands of pounds being invited to the Champions League finals by bookmakers? What has changed? Mr. Rhodes seems to think that the inclusion of more rules will remedy this, but the rules were in place. There were plenty of rules for many years that were supposed to stop bookmakers behaving like this and didn't. So, fundamentally, it doesn't really matter if you're going to make lots more rules if you're making them for people who either don't want or refuse to obey them, or, as we discussed, Pete, during our interview, are not perhaps capable of making them because for so long their regulatory function has been, dysfunctional, I suppose. And it does seem to me that the new affordability checks presuppose a complete shift in the cynicism of some operators, as well as the ability of their self-regulatory function. I don't understand why anyone thinks that is going to change. And I think a fundamental observation I made about Ms. Rhodes's interview was perhaps what I would see as a failure to understand the nature of the beast that he regulates sometimes.
Yeah, I find it hard to see how the bookmaker couldn't do it, because fundamentally they're the ones that are fined if it goes wrong. So if you had a third party saying, unless it was very prescriptive, like Harry was saying about 15% of disposable income, that's what you're allowed to deposit, net deposit each month, or something like that. If it's not that kind of system, then surely if the bookmaker is responsible for the outcome, they have to be the one who has the information to make the decision. And they also have all the patterns of play data, which I think is far more valuable than someone's disposable income in order to decide whether they're actually suffering from gambling harm.
Chris, question for you, which I'm interested in, is there's obviously a difference between a bookmaker obtaining the information and then the bookmaker using that information to make a call on what they should do with it. In other words, how they should treat the customer having got the information they've got. I've not seen very much on what a bookmaker is supposed, where the bookmaker is supposed to draw the lines and how they're supposed to react. Have you come across much proposed guidance on that front?
No, I've seen nothing on it. That's the point. So obviously I work in machine learning, building models, and the way I do it is the least possible data points, the better. There's no point in collecting more and more and more data, especially if you don't even know what the what the target is, what you're trying to actually achieve, they're just going to end up with a huge pool of data that they might use for nefarious reasons. But I don't see how they can actually use it to make a decision on if someone's suffering from harm.
And put yourself in the shoes of an operator, of a person working in the compliance team who is now being deluged with that information and doesn't appear to have any guidance as to how they're supposed to apply it to customers.
Yeah, I think you would be overcautious.
Yeah.
You would not want to be fined. You would think this person has got £3,000 disposable income a month. Well, we'll let them net deposit 1,000 because we don't know what else they've got to buy, and perhaps that's what's happening, and that's far too low for what some people want to do.
I was going to go back to the comments around the frustration about how long this has taken, and again, it just felt a bit disingenuous because the line that was given was that the Gambling Commission opened its call for evidence in, I think it was November 2020, and then they suddenly decided actually this was better for the government to deal with via its white paper. Well, the Gambling Commission knew in advance of publishing that call for evidence that the DCMS call for evidence on the Gambling Act review was imminent. In fact, they'd expected it to go in October, and it finally went in December, a month after their call for evidence. The survey that they published, or that they made available in January 2021 of 12,125 bettors, that was made available after the DCMS had launched their call for evidence. So this idea that they were doing it and then suddenly they realised this is better for the government to do just doesn't ring true, because the government was always going to look at this. It feels a little bit like that. I mean, I get told by Mr. Rhodes when I'm being incorrect, and maybe I will this time, but it feels a little bit like it's being used as an excuse to rationalise the non-disclosure of all the evidence from the call for evidence in 2020, including the views of more than 12,000 punters who seem to have been utterly disregarded in this process. And it's worth saying, I think it's potentially, it's really worrying that a regulator would launch call for evidence, and more than 3 years later, the results of that have still not been disclosed, because it means they can have played no part in the decision-making process, which means the whole call for evidence, if that is the case, was a complete waste of time. And again, it's just something that it'd be much better if we had a very honest response about why we ended up in this situation with both the Gambling Commission and then the DCMS looking in separately into affordability checks.
Yeah, it's a very convenient excuse, and obviously he talked about the call for evidence being published, but I think it speaks to the lack of faith and transparency people see with this organisation, that perhaps there was no plan to publish the call for evidence once they saw what the results were, as it didn't align with what they were like, what they wanted, or what they were contrasted with their plans. But from a betting point of view, when you look at things like that, of course you're going to question, why bother? They've already made their mind up, and they're no interest in publishing 12,000 submissions from ordinary people about this particular topic. So
yeah, and it's not even the submissions, because the mini survey was done in a way such that you could just present the results. You wouldn't have to show every single response. You just have to show how many people supported it. But we put in a Freedom of Information Act request to try to get this. And the response we got back from the Gambling Commission was that there was no public interest in making this evidence available, which is astonishing, really. I think, if people had known at the time that the call for evidence was taking place and they were taking the time and effort to submit their views, that the Commission would see no public interest in making the results available until after the policy had been determined, I think people probably wouldn't have bothered. And I think that's really worrying. I think that, all this evidence has been sidelined here.
Well, yeah. And for example, the 100,000 people that signed a petition, and the feeling that people don't have a voice and they're not listened to, certainly all kind of feeds that narrative from what I've seen. So I wanted to also talk then about the black market, because that was a key component of our conversation. And I think one of the interesting points that he made was the admission that people are going to go somewhere. So if they're not able to bet in the legal market, they could well go into the black market. That jumped out at me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it kind of brings into question what are the point of these affordability checks? What we really need is a tool where people can be warned about their behaviour. It can be highlighted to them. Look, you're betting too many hours. It's impacting your life like this or that, and to collect the data and present that to people to make their own choice. Because just saying to someone, oh, we're ending our relationship with you because you're spending too much, if they're an addict, they're not going to stop betting. They're going to go to the next operator, or eventually if they run out of operators, they're going to seek it on the black market. And we already know that, I think there was a study in 2021 that showed 10% of people on the GamStop system have already used the black market. So, if people are shut out and they can't bet on the legal market and they're an addict or they're suffering harm, they're going to go to the black market where there won't be any sort of tools to help them if they run into problems. So I think the focus really ought to be on creating proper machine learning based tools on the trillions of bets that the bookmakers have access to, and perhaps match that against the number of people that sign up for GamStop or self-exclude. And you can then work out a probability that a certain pattern of play will lead to someone self-excluding, and then sort of gently warn people about this, rather than just saying, no, you can't bet, and then off they go to the black market.
I have some sympathy with the Gambling Commission on the black market, because, funnily enough, it's a market that's been created by the exposure of so many people to regulated gambling. And now that genie is out of the bottle, even if you made gambling illegal tomorrow, all you would really be doing is turning the current market into a black market. I'm not sure there's a great deal that they can do it. He talks really in terms of what they can do to websites and all the stuff they can do with Google and this sort of thing. But he, fair play to him, he openly admits that WhatsApp groups are things that they can't really do very much about at the moment. Well, ever, I don't think. And I think that it's going to be very difficult ever to get a handle on what's going on in WhatsApp betting, and particularly because of the figures that people are dealing with in WhatsApp betting. It's not normal, in my experience of seeing elements of it and hearing about it. It's not people betting in fivers and tenors. That is where serious sums of money are changing hands with dodgy people, and sums of money that no one knows where it's come from. And I mean, affordability, frankly, is the last of anyone's concerns.
The black market is often sort of treated as though it's this sort of force of nature, or this, I don't know, the Klingon fleet hovering above the planet or something like that. Like it's this malevolent force. But in fact, the black market is really the accumulation of lots of decisions by individual citizens to do something the state won't allow them to do. And so I think the biggest concern for me about the black market, there are other concerns about things like tax leakage and prevention of harm and things like that. But the biggest sort of philosophical concern here is that you get a big black market when the state is stopping citizens doing what they want to do. And I think when that happens, we really should take a step back and say, is this the outcome that we intend? And one of the things that's telling really in all of this, and actually in most of the regulations that have been passed, and we've seen a lot in the last few years, is how little consideration in these consultation documents have been given to unintended negative consequences, or even the suggestion that we might want to study the impact of regulatory change on unintended negative consequences, like people going off to unlicensed operators. It just doesn't seem to have been a matter of great interest to the Commission, certainly going off the consultations that they've run. And I've not really seen any evaluation or attempts to evaluate things like, what happened when we moved to multi-operator self-exclusion? Did we see a number of people then disappear off? I know GamStop's done it, but we haven't done it from a regulatory perspective. I think in Sweden, the regulator said an astonishingly high number of people in the black market are there because they're self-excluded. And they may not even, to use Chris's word, they may not be addicts or they may not be problem gamblers. People who self-exclude aren't necessarily people having problems with their gambling. So I think that's the big thing here is when you get a big black market, it should be a signal that something's out of balance in the regulation of the market that's stopping people doing what they want to do. And we really should, a bit like, how do we get here on affordability checks? It warrants examination.
I think that's exactly right. But the one thing I would just add is, of course, the black market is not a creation of affordability checks. Insofar as it has a single creator, the largest contributor to it, I would say, is bookmaker restrictions. And that's something that doesn't seem to have really registered with the Gambling Commission. They don't really see restrictions as something that needs to be tackled. They either say it's a customer care issue, or they point to the fact that there's no minimum bet law. Those two facts may well be right, but it doesn't change the underlying problem that is a huge contributor to the black market.
Yes, and it's worth remembering that there are 3 licensing objectives, and one of them is to keep crime out. So
quite.
If you are either allowing practices or you're encouraging them, themselves through your regulation, that lead to the growth in criminal activity, then as a regulator, you're not fulfilling the demands that are placed on you by Parliament.
Yeah, and I think his sort of point on Andrew Rhodes on the podcast was that they can't really prevent it. They can do all these sort of tinkering with Google and so on. But I think he said that the goal is to prevent illegal gambling at scale. Now, it's kind of a difficult area because prior to, I think, 2014, pretty much all online gambling was based offshore. So it's come back onshore in the, sort of the recent last decade. And yeah, this could lead to a lot of that going back offshore.
Just jumping in, I thought one of the most extraordinary points made, as I understood him to say, was that they investigated a couple of complaints from people who thought they were gambling with unlicensed bookmakers, but they turned out to be licensed bookmakers. I would have thought that's something of an alarm bell for a regulator, that there are consumers who think that licensed bookmakers are unlicensed bookmakers. And I'd suggest that that is perhaps quite a neat encapsulation of the general confusion at the moment. It's one thing confusing an unlicensed bookmaker for a licensed one, but thinking that a licensed bookmaker is unlicensed doesn't exactly seem to me to be a great success in regulation in terms of consumer protection.
That's right. I'd also add in that some of these black market websites are quite advanced. I looked at a few myself, and they are obviously a fair amount of investments gone into them, and they are directly targeting people. For example, you mentioned there, Chris and Dan, you talked to me about it prior to the podcast, 10% of GamStop users admit to using unlicensed firms. So they are actively being targeted. And the fact that previously we had such a small black market speaks to a success of regulation. And like you say now, the sweeping away of people into that, whether it be through affordability, through restrictions, suggests there is a hole when it comes to regulation that needs tackling.
I mean, I'm not saying, Andrew Rhodes was interviewed. He didn't say everything the Commission's doing, so there may be some selection in this. But the tone from the Commission on black market seems to be out, we can take enforcement action here. But I think more important than that is really to understand, why is this happening? Do we need to recalibrate some of our regulations? Because we really understand why people are going to the black market, and we take steps to address those reasons while maintaining protections for all gamblers, then that seems to be a far preferable solution than trying to whack-a-mole through enforcement. But there's no evidence that that's happening at the moment. There's not really much suggestion that's in the mindset of the Commission at the moment.
Yeah, so we have quite a lot here at the same point, isn't it? We have a lack of guidelines, a lack of clarity, a lack of forethought, and people actually digging into some of this and providing guidelines and proper detailed information to make informed decisions. And we see that across the board, whether that be affordability, how much people can spend, without guidelines for operators, all these things. So that seems to be a theme throwing through so much of what's taking place here.
Sorry, Pete, can I say one thing? I think it's worth picking up. I think one point that needs to be addressed. At one point, I think this is what Andrew Rhodes was saying, he seemed to suggest the Racing Post was somehow culpable for the rise in black market activity because it reports on black market activity. If that is what he was attempting to convey, I think that's rather questionable. We don't blame rises in crime on the fact that newspapers write about crime. So I think this idea that the Racing Post's coverage of this issue is some way responsible for the rise in black market activity, I think is really quite speculative, and is not something that a regulator should be doing if that is what he meant to convey.
No, I completely agree. The approach to the Racing Post generally is unedifying. I think he was saying that. I think he said that it wasn't helpful that they were highlighting as though they were sort of advertising black market bookmaking websites. I thought that was very unfair and frankly a misunderstanding of public interest journalism.
And I thought also his point going on from that about not engaging with people if they are what he would describe as aggressive or disagree with him in a certain sense, that those groups he wouldn't, I think at the Gamblers Consumer Forum and things like that, he sort of implied because they took a certain stance, he would not engage with them. And I think that's unhelpful, because it means that obviously there's a lot of gamblers out there that are very angry with what's going on. And if he's not willing to engage with them and understand what's actually going on the ground, it's like there's a huge disconnect between what we see when we try and place bets and withdraw money and get restricted and get these affordability checks, and what he seems to think's going on with his fantasy of this frictionless check just seems completely disconnected. So I think the Commission itself should be engaging in some way more with gamblers. They have the lived experience of people that are suffering with harm. They have industry people in there, but gamblers just seem to be completely left out of it. And we're the people that are actually, at the end of the day, losing gamblers are the people that finance the whole show.
Yeah. I was going to ask that, it segues nicely because Harry, obviously you've got a letter and you've got a meeting with him. Are we seeing any evidence beyond coming on a podcast and sending you a letter of a different approach with the Gambling Commission, of trying to talk with people even if they disagree, and trying to get their experiences and bring them in rather than, for example, with the Racing Post, I agree. I think that was the point he was trying to make. He's no fan of that. He really should be engaging with them and their audience because they represent a large tranche of people who bet in an industry he oversees the regulation of.
I think that the point that he's missing out on a huge amount of helpful intelligence by not speaking. The people who know most, in my experience, about punting and the realities of it are the type of person that subscribes to the Racing Post, are the people that, for example, listen to this podcast. And by not listening to them, I just think you're really missing out on an awful lot. Forget that you might not necessarily agree with them, but I would say that it's quite a unique industry in that there is an element of it that is highly educated on the industry that's being regulated, but they're not corporate. And so that seems to be a bit of a culture clash, frankly, because the Gambling Commission is a very corporate body. Everyone involved in it seems to be very corporate minded. But you've got, I just think, a huge resource. And I think it's a pity the Gambling Commission historically doesn't really seem to want to dip into it. Yes, he's asked me for an interview, and that, fair play. Yes, he's come onto your interview, which is great. So maybe this is a bright new dawn. It is certainly not the way that the Gambling Commission has behaved historically. Someone mentioned the Freedom of Information Act request earlier, which just triggered a memory, which was I asked for once an old a copy of the LCCP as it had been sort of 2 years previously. I got a very polite email, a week later. Thank you very much. Please submit a Freedom of Information Act request to get a copy of their own LCCP that was up on their website for God knows how long. There has not been good communication. And I think that one of the things that perhaps Mr. Rhodes could have addressed in his interview with you was that the Gambling Commission is not just what it's done today, what it's doing now. It is what it has been since its inception, whatever it was, 2007. Well, it was created by the Act. And that a lot of the problems that we face today are failures of regulation. And that's a point that doesn't really seem to occur to them.
Yeah.
I agree with Harry. I think perhaps people in positions of authority sometimes find it hard to admit fallibility, even if it's fallibility on behalf of their organisations. And the Commission is a collection of individuals. They're human beings. They are fallible. They do make mistakes. I think it's been almost unheard of for the Gambling Commission to ever admit that it's made a mistake. And I think that's unhelpful because it doesn't breed trust. And maybe they just think that if they admit mistake, they'll get pounced on. But when you make mistakes, you have to confess and you have to say sorry, and the world forgives you and you move on. It's when you cover those mistakes up or pretend things didn't happen that the trust really starts to drain very quickly. So yeah, I agree with Harry. I think coming back to the point made earlier, when you're a new CEO, you're in a brilliant position to come in, review everything, talk to lots of people. Don't just talk to people inside your organisation or people who come from different, ideological views that you might agree with, but talk to lots of stakeholders, really understand what's going on. And if things have been done imperfectly in the past, admit it. And I think then you build trust because you've admitted the problems. Therefore, people will have some faith that you're going to address them. But when you just try and sweep things under the carpet, it erodes trust. And it probably means that the issues don't get dealt with properly because you're not actually owning up to them in the first place.
And it also creates, we see like allegations of bias that either through ineptitude or inexperience or the fact that maybe even some people suggest that they're scared to take on bookmakers. Let's face it, some of these companies are extremely powerful multinational corporations. And the Gambling Commission, as well-meaning as they might be, is only, 370 people? So whether it comes to taking on the black market, there is an element that says, look, we're doing our best. But, it does create this, because there's no honesty and transparency or admitting to previous mistakes. This narrative that some people have that, they're quite happy for the status quo to unfold, or they are in some way biased or not really interested in the things that impact us day-to-day bettors.
We have seen clear expressions of bias from people either within the commission or around it. For example, the chair of their advisory board for safer gambling, in relation to the much discussed and perhaps a subject for another day, but fundamentally dishonest claims about suicidality in gambling. She wrote that, yes, the claims about suicide and gambling were inaccurate, but that didn't matter. And so I think, when you see stuff like that, you really start to question to what extent are the people in these organisations genuinely impartial and independent, and to what extent, biases are affecting the decisions they're making.
But obviously, one of the things we talked about in the podcast was the fact that the UK is the biggest betting industry around the world. But from other jurisdictions, I imagine, are they looking on with peculiar interest in what's taking place here? Because you look to, for example, the US, which is more of a burgeoning market, they're probably looking at this going, well, this might be us in 5 to 10 years. Let's see what the UK does and how that works out.
The US people I speak to cannot get their heads around what's happening in this country. They simply don't understand how consumers of anything would be required to hand over bank statements or submit to open banking in order to spend their own money. They simply can't understand it. It's a cultural sort of rift. I wonder, though, whether that might change, because I think, it does seem to be that the betting industry in the US is going out of its way to make itself unpopular and is not learning from the mistakes that have made in Europe and Australia. And also, I think we've seen, perhaps through things like COVID and other things, certainly in the last 10 years, we've seen that the land of the free isn't quite as free as it thought it was. So, at the moment, I think we're getting, frankly, baffled looks from across the Atlantic at what's going on here. But doesn't mean it couldn't happen.
I think there is quite a bit of contagion of regulations. Like, I think credit card bans came in here and then they came in Australia. Different countries are looking at advertising in different ways. So I think probably people will look at what's happening with affordability here and decide, did it work? Did it actually reduce gambling harm, if that is indeed the goal? And I think when they find out that it's been a complete shambles, they will say, no, thank you.
The question is whether it will be shown to be a complete shambles, because I suspect that the organisation responsible for evaluating the impact of affordability checks will be the organisation that imposes it. So unless either the industry or another organisation puts in place a suitably sort of scientific evaluation of this, maybe racing, then we may end up in a situation where the Gambling Commission's marking its homework and will declare affordability checks a resounding success. I mean, that's definitely a danger of what might happen with the pilot survey. I think it's the Gambling Commission that will determine whether the pilot survey is a success or not, which means that, going back to something we talked about just a moment ago, what are the odds that the Gambling Commission is actually going to come out and say, no, this wasn't such a great idea after all, let's go back to how we were?
I completely agree. That seems a remote likelihood, particularly when they haven't set out what success looks like.
Agreed.
Exactly.
And of course, what we have mentioned here as well, change of government. We're likely to have one within the next 9 months, possibly the peak amount or the most amount of time before we'll have a change, and everything points to a different government, potentially another different gambling minister. We might have a few more before then, who knows, but at least one. And then, obviously things could change again, depending upon what they wish to do. Which brings me forward to my, to wrapping things up. I'd love to get each of your thoughts, I suppose, on what A, you would like to see, but then B, what you expect to see happen with this whole saga as it starts to unfold. What are your predictions?
I would repeat what I said at the start. What I would like to see is a proper investigation into why we're in this place in the first place, because people are not being honest about that. This idea that the gambling industry has just spontaneously decided to impose these checks in the last few years is not credible. So a proper investigation of why we're in this situation, and also an examination of what the impact has been. What has happened to consumers when they're asked to provide documents at certain thresholds and things like that. So that's what I'd like to see happen. What I think is likely to happen is we will see the pilot will come in. It will be succeeded by the plans as set out originally in the white paper. And thereafter, it could get even worse. And the reason I say that is that we've got a new gambling prevalence survey landing in July, which is a move away from the health survey. It is expected to result in problem gambling rates about 10 times what the NHS thinks they are. And the problem gambling rate is a key variable in calculating the thresholds for affordability checks. So if the Gambling Commission's being consistent then there is no reason to believe that the thresholds for affordability checks set out in the white paper will be the floor. In fact, it's entirely conceivable that in the succeeding years, we may see those thresholds creep down.
What I'd like to see is a definition of what we're actually trying to achieve here, and then build a solution to that problem. And if it is to reduce gambling harm, if the frictionless checks can be an input into giving some information on the financial situation that individuals face, that then is added to all the other information that the companies have on patterns of play. If we can have some sort of standardized data set with trillions of data points of bets, and this can somehow be modeled to help to give individuals information, and if it sort of points towards there might be something harm, just to advise them, nudge them. I don't think we should ever be saying to someone, if you've got £1 million in your bank account, you can only bet 20,000. I think if you've got £1 million, you should be able to bet £1 million. So I'd like to see it being the individual's responsibility, but for the operators to give them as much information as possible on. So, for instance, now I think you can now just about see your profit and loss for the last year in most operators. But for a long time, you couldn't even look back that far, because obviously the bookmaker doesn't want you to know you're losing on this type of sport or you lose on in-play bets. But really, all this data should be available, and perhaps third-party apps and so on could then analyze it and just give the user a knowledge of how their betting is going. And then obviously within that sort of app, you could then advise people. And if there was pointing to problems, they could then sort of say, well, you really ought to be getting help for this and where you can get help and all that sort of. I think that would be a far better way of doing it, to include the gambler and the potential person suffering harm in the decision, rather than an operator just grabbing a huge amount of data and then turning around and saying, you can't bet, or you're only allowed to deposit this much. I just don't think that is the answer to solving the problem. What I think is actually going to happen is this pilot will go through. It'll provide some information from credit reference agencies that the bookmakers will find useful. But at the end of the day, it's not going to help compliance teams on big customers that want to deposit large amounts. They're still going to need the extra information. And I think going back to the white paper, the number was given at 0.6% of accounts, which is about 180,000 accounts. We'll have to give that extra information. I don't think that's going to change. I think all they've done is drawn the whole process out for another 18 months, and we'll end up with what the white paper proposed. And I don't think it'll solve or reduce gambling harm at all. I think in many ways with the black market threat, it'll actually make it worse.
I'm going to make a slightly broader point than affordability checks. And at the beginning of the interview with Andrew Rhodes, he said that the Gambling Commission was effectively an enabling organisation because it was created by the Gambling Act, and it was created to fulfil the purpose of the Gambling Act, which was to liberalise the gambling market. So that's one side of it. And then he said, so as long as people meet the licensing criteria, then we're effectively obliged to give them a licence. And then he went on to say the other half of it, the job, is to make sure they then comply with the licensing requirements. And it's the second part of that I think that the Gambling Commission has historically let itself down. I think it's perfectly reasonable, in my experience, of giving licenses to people who should get them. I think that it has not been strong enough or transparent enough where there have been bookmaker transgressions over the years. And I really emphasize the transparency, actually, because I think that it's one of the roles of regulation is to be seen to be in control of the market you're regulating. It's not to do things behind closed doors. And there were a number of sort of references in the interview to things that we might not all know is happening, and that they don't live tweet everything they're doing. I think there could be a great deal more explanation of how the Gambling Commission is dealing with bookmakers that are breaching the LCCP or whatever provisions they're breaching. And until it's clear that the Gambling Commission is using the licensing framework properly now, I just don't really understand why there's an emphasis on essentially putting in more rules and more checks. Because as yet, there's not much confidence within the industry that the rules and the regulatory role of the Gambling Commission is being terribly efficiently discharged. And so what I would like to see, I suppose, from the Gambling Commission is a great deal more transparency, including when they're fining companies, to actually explain exactly what's gone on. Not an example of someone went in and was able to deposit £30,000 during a week. There should be a full report of exactly what it is. And that helps operators to understand what they must and mustn't do. And it also shows punters that there is someone looking out for them. And so I think that would be a huge boon to the entire industry if the regulator could take an approach that involves being seen to regulate. And it doesn't seem to consider that to be a terribly important part of its role. It does seem to me uniquely keen to operate behind the curtain. I would like to see that change.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys. Some really good points there. A little bit of doom and gloom thrown in, but I think we can see from each of your answers there, like some ways forward and how things can be improved. I know Andrew Rhodes listens to this, or he certainly has listened to a few of the podcasts, it seems. So hopefully he listens to this, and why not bring each of you in and have you inside and helping and providing constructive dialogue. I feel like that would be one of the best decisions they could make. So thank you each for your time. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Thank you for responding and giving the time to put forward your opinions and reactions and predictions as well. Thank you ever so much, guys. And thank you as well for listening.